In March of 2018, the Michigan Department of Education released the new school accountability data through a school index system through the BioSecure site. There are directions on the SI timeline how to download the school index for the 2016-17 assessment data. The accountability data will download as a Microsoft Excel file, and the first tab will be some instructions, and then the tab next to that will be basically where you begin, and you can search for any school name to learn the building code. Now, you probably already know your building code, so you can just enter your building code here. If you have a generic name like school, it's simply going to give you the first 5 results of school names that have the name school in them. So you might not see your particular school. If you need to look up your school code, you can browse these tabs to the far right where it says data. And on that far right data tab, you will see that I've created some false building codes, 11 and 12 and 13 here. These are sample schools that do not actually exist. So everything that you see in this presentation is false data. However, it is for instructional purposes to help you understand the school index itself. Once you have your building code, you can click here or go to the Overview tab, and it will give you your school name and some other demographic information, and it will give you this overall index with tabs both at the top and at the bottom that correspond to each other. The tab for summative growth takes you to this tab in the Excel file. For proficiency, it takes you to this tab in the Excel file. For this first video on the school index, we're going to explain what it means to be a comprehensive support school and just overall what this school index looks like. We will also dive into the tabs for summative participation and English learner participation. When you think of school accountability, you probably think of the 2 most recent systems that were in play, both the top to bottom ranking system, which gave you an overall ranking, say of the 99th percentile, where the 50th percentile represented the state average, and everything was averaged according to the state and the specific grade level and the specific test that students took. They use these things called Z-scores to really give that standardized score on if you're average, above average, or below average. And then they aggregated those for all 4 content areas and an achievement gap. The subgroups were actually reported out on a scorecard that would give you an overall color code. For this particular school, they were yellow, but they were at the 99th percentile, and they were given a reward status. These were the 3 summative labels that we've been used to the last few years, and with the scorecard, we tended to see a grid with many of our subgroups by ethnicity, economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, English learners, and so forth. With the replacement system, the school index, it attempts to combine the 2 of these into one school index, and it no longer utilizes bottom 30%. The best way for me to describe this new system, it is like using a standard grading scale from 0 to 100%, but it's set on a curve. So, for example, if we set the curve so that we wanted schools to achieve 75% proficiency, then we would call that an A. But we're not using letter grades, so instead of calling it an A, if they reached that high proficiency, we would give them somewhere in the 90 to 100% range. If they were close to the target, and the target was 75%, we would give them in the 80s. 80-85% that would liken often to a B. Though the system is not reporting letter grades, it's built on that intuitive system that the percentage that it puts out is representative of a standard grading scale that might be translated into a letter grade. This means that 99% doesn't mean that 99% of your students were proficient, or 99% of your students grew adequately, or 99% of your students were participating on the test. What this means is that there was a target set for each of those components, and if the ELA target is 60%, and if the school has 60% of kids proficient, then you've met 100% of the target, and you will not see the 60, you will see 100% of the target is met. This will hopefully be a little bit more intuitive than Z-scores, but of course it will create some of its own issues, especially in terms of proficiency, which I will attempt to explain in the second video. Here is a mock-up from the Michigan Department of Education from a year ago when their school index system was going to be summarized into a single letter grade. This is no longer the case. We are not using letter grades, but what you'll notice that some of these categories of proficiency and growth, school quality, English learner progress, graduation rate, and assessment participation are still being used. And proficiency and growth have the most weight on the system. Here is an example of how their system is looking, where you still have growth and proficiency, and you'll notice that the component weight is the majority is growth. It has the largest amount of weight. The next largest is proficiency. School quality is the third largest. And then graduation rate and English learner progress are each at 10%, and participation is at 3%, actually broken up into 2% for summative and 1% for English learners. So each of the components is calculated at a percent of the target. So for example, participation, the target is 95% of students will take the state test. If they met the 95% target, then this is recorded as 100%. It's 3% of the overall weight, so you get 3 points. So we take the 80, multiply it by the 34, and we get 27.2. When you add all of these up, you get this single summative score of 72.3, which is on that standard grading scale, but it's set to a curve. So it doesn't mean you were 72% proficient. It means you had 70% of the targeted points set by the state. And some people might translate that to a C, but we're not reporting letter grades. The purpose of that overall index is not a percentile rank, so it's not to say you're in the 72nd percentile. It's to put it on this scale of 0 to 100, but it is somewhat to rank schools. And it's attempting to identify the lowest 5% of schools. And those, instead of being named priority, will be named comprehensive support schools, and they'll be labeled every 3 years. Targeted and additional targeted schools are replacing what we used to call focus schools. Targeted schools will be labeled every year, and additional targeted schools will be labeled every 3 years. Let's take a look at how this system identifies these 3 federal labels.